Welcome, everyone. Good evening. We are very excited that you could join us today for Defund Fear. I'm Alex Elliott, the Senior Manager of Events and Engagement for the Public Programs Department of California Institute of Integral Studies, a nonprofit university in San Francisco. As many of us are descendants of settlers, immigrants, or descendants of those forcefully brought to this continent, we, CIIS Public Programs, must recognize and never forget that our university's building in San Francisco occupies traditional, unceded Ramaytush Ohlone lands. If you are interested in learning more about Native lands, languages, and territories, we encourage you to visit native-land.ca. Now let me first introduce our presenters, Zach Norris and Sonya Shah, and then we'll get right to their conversation. Sonya Shah is an associate professor at California Institute of Integral Studies in the School of Undergraduate Studies. In 2016, Sonya initiated the Ahisma Collective, an organization that works to respond to harm in ways that foster wholeness for everyone. Central to her core values are nurturing community belonging and collective care, healing, compassion, love, and transforming harm. Sonya is a Buddhist, a first-generation immigrant from the northwestern part of India, and feels most at home in nature. Zach Norris is the executive director of the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, which creates campaigns related to civic engagement, violence prevention, juvenile justice, and police brutality, with a goal of shifting economic resources away from prisons and punishment and towards economic opportunity. He is also the co-founder of Restore Oakland and Justice for Families, both of which focus on the power of community action. He graduated from Harvard and took his law degree from New York University. And now it is my absolute pleasure to turn it over to Zach and Sonya.
All right. Thank you so much, Alex. And welcome, Zach. It's so exciting to be here.
Great to be talking with you. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
And thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Alex. I'm such a big fan of you. And
oh, likewise.
Yeah, Ella Baker Center, all your work. And I said this to you on our initial phone call, that this is like a way for me to live out my secret life of being the brown version of a Krista Tippett.
So yes, I'm glad I can help you live your best life, Sonya.
You are. The privilege to interview you is the best. And just sort of, honestly, just to like really love on people doing amazing work. So
all right on. Well, likewise, your work advancing restorative justice is phenomenal. So I'm really grateful to be being interviewed by you.
Awesome. So, I think people always want to know you and who Zach is. And people often first want to know the person and what moves you before we talk about your amazing ideas. So I guess that's a good place to start is, what's your personal entry into this?
No, I appreciate that. When you first said that, what moves you, I thought like, well, my kids are upstairs. They're right now playing Roblox. So hopefully that'll distract them. But during this presentation, if I step away for a second, it's because I'm tending to my daughters who are 8 and 11 years old, but I trust that that won't happen. I am from Oakland. I still live in Oakland. I was born in San Francisco. We moved to Oakland when I was a week old. I like to say it was a week too late, just because I love Oakland that much. My mom is a retired elementary school teacher. My dad is a janitor, not yet retired, former shipyard worker. And their work and their lives really shaped me. Growing up in East Oakland really shaped me, but not until I was actually at Harvard as an undergrad. I went to a number of different Catholic schools. My parents and grandparents scraped and saved to send me to Catholic school. And then at Harvard, I saw just how differently young people could be treated when they made mistakes, right? And I saw also coming home each summer that was a unique thing, that some of the bubble that I was surrounded by, being a light-skinned African-American Catholic school attending, Harvard student, like those were levels of privilege that many of my peers didn't have. And they ended up in jails, youth jails and prisons and adult prisons because they didn't have, because they were targeted effectively. And a lot of the sort of statistics I started to learn as a college undergrad, just the way in which youth of color were being targeted by the juvenile justice system. And that's what led me to an interest in work at the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights. And I've been really there ever since, starting as a law school student intern.
Amazing. One of the things that you wrote this really deep, amazing book. And honestly, I'm from the
Thanks.
East Coast. And so I don't have as much history in the Bay Area, but reading it made me feel more connected to the Bay
Right
Area
on.
because you give really, really beautiful little history lessons of Oakland and Richmond and other
Yeah.
places.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that we wanted to start out with talking about was that this book is about safety, and
Mm,
you create and offer like a really deep framework for safety.
mm.
So maybe that's a great place for us to start, just sort of
Sure.
in the meta, kind of
Sure.
laying
Sure.
that out.
Sure. Yeah. Well,
Mhm.
we'll go meta abstract.
Meta abstract. Let's start there. The big, big, big picture.
But really taking it to, anyone who's listening or watching this, if you took a moment and just took a breath, and I feel like right now we could all use a moment and a breath. And actually, even before I talk about safety, I just want to, invite everybody to take a breath and to take a moment, and take a moment of silence for so many who have lost their lives just this week, to violence. And and I think it's an important time as any for us to remember about what makes us feel safe, especially given what's happened just this past week. And so I often, having learned from other folks who are in social justice movements who have encouraged us to think of a time when we felt safe. And so I often ask people, what's a time when you felt safe? And a lot of times people say, well, I felt safe when I was with my faith community, or I felt safe in the context of my family, be they biological or chosen family. I felt safe just when I was around folks who cared about me. And there's this way in which that consistently safety is really tied to relationship. It's tied to being in a community where people care for you. And it's almost really biologically hardwired. I was listening to someone talk about sleep, and they were describing how the idea behind people, having different chronotypes, like I always wake up from like 3 to 5, or, I can't go to sleep from this time to this time. Many believe that it's because we were taking care of each other during the evening, to make sure that, the big predators weren't able to come and gobble us up, right? So there's this biological aspect and cultural aspect of relationship that helps to ground us in safety. And yet all of our public safety systems are so geared towards actually ending relationship, severing ties. And so when someone makes a mistake, particularly if they're poor, if they're Black, if they're a marginalized person of, based on gender, race, ability, then they're more likely to end up in our nation's prison system. And we've spent, the past 40 years building out what is the largest prison system in the entire world. We spend, 53 cents of every federal dollar on the military, 23 new prisons, and just one new university built, over the past 30 years in California. The lion's share of every municipal budget goes to policing. And so there's this way in which we've designed our public safety systems in ways that actually end relationship and sever ties. And what the book talks about is how do we actually move our notions of public policy and public safety to actually more line up with our felt understanding of what safety is. And that's not, there's no silver bullet, to use a really bad metaphor to getting there, there are a series of things that we need to pay attention to and shift if we are going to achieve greater safety inside the United States.
Yeah, you really went to the meta,
Right.
and also to the real sense of what's deeply personal in terms of how we feel safe,
Mm.
and also what's maybe more community based and how we create safety. So, there's, as you're writing this book and you're talking about safety, you're naturally also talking about crime and harm. And you
Yes.
make a really important distinction between crime and harm. And I'm wondering if you can just sort of speak to that right
Yeah,
now.
sure. No, I really appreciate that question. Like for me, the basic distinction between crime and harm is that crime is a smaller subset of a larger notion of harm. And we tend to focus on in our criminal court system on crime on the streets rather than crime in the suites of power,
Right.
crime in the kind of corner block rather than crime in the corner offices, in ways that allow the perpetuation and continuation of larger systems of harm. So what are those larger systems of harm? Those larger systems of harm are white supremacy, our patriarchy, our capitalism. And I describe in the book the way in which, those systems have remained undisturbed, even though they've caused so much harm to so many people and to the planet. And our notions of safety, our ways of really dealing with that larger set of harms impact, not just our ability to get to safety, but also the shape of our democracy.
Right.
So one of the things that I describe in the book is the difference between what I call the "he keeps us safe" lie of would-be dictators and authoritarians versus the "we keep us safe" truth. And this "he keeps us safe" lie is fundamentally a patriarchal abusive lie. It's a lie that abusive people tell. If if one finds themselves in an abusive relationship, often that abusive partner is telling them, don't trust your neighbor, don't trust your mother, don't trust your girlfriend, don't trust the people closest to you, only trust me. Don't talk to those people, right? And authoritarians really mimic that on a countrywide scale. They say, don't trust your neighbor around the block, don't trust your neighbor at the border, don't trust your neighbor in distant lands, really only trust me, even while that person is often disguising and hiding a lot of the harms associated with those larger systems that I described. And so if we can move to a fundamental understanding that actually, when you take care of the public, you take care of public safety, that when you respond to public health issues like drug use and abuse and homelessness and school discipline and even violence with a public health approach, you're much more likely to actually produce a broader suite of safety and to make everyone safe. And that is something that I think we can absolutely do. And the book really talks about like specific examples of how we move that forward and what that looks like in practice.
Yeah, I want to ask one more thing and then get to some examples, because I
Sure.
think there was something that moved me in your book. And I think this concept of looking at the structure of fear and the way that you describe it in terms of these modalities of, in the "he keeps us safe" lie of
Yeah.
deprivation and punishment and isolation,
Yeah.
and suspicion. And it was really moving to think about that as a way to slice the pie, right?
Yeah.
If we create a suspicious society or a punishment-based society, a society where we're afraid to be close to each other and we're kept isolated and there's no
Yeah.
belonging. And so, yeah, I maybe just to speak to that structure of fear a little bit, because I think it's really the setup for then how do we move out of a punishment-based society, out of suspicion, out of isolation.
Right on. No, I
Yeah.
really appreciate that question too. It's just like what I describe in the book is an overarching kind of framework of fear that has really governed our approach to safety inside of the United States. And it's divided into basically 4 categories. So suspicion, and really looking towards people who have been marginalized and othered inside our society, from Indigenous people, Black folks, people of color more broadly, people of different faiths. Isolation, both in the context of the prison system itself, in terms of the deeper you go into it, the more isolated you are likely to be, but also isolation in a broader sense of people feeling isolated from one another. So people looking at their phones and finding out about crimes in their neighborhood rather than actually reaching out to their neighbors to engage folks in the context of what would make us more safe. And deprivation, as you mentioned, which, you know, I think about, I live just a stone's throw away from Eastmont Town Center, which used to be Eastmont Mall, which I describe in the book as used to be before that a big car factory, right? And so there's this way in which the car factory shut down, people of color moved in, there is a lack of resources for Black and brown communities in Oakland, but more broadly, that is described in terms of deprivation. And finally, punishment being the way in which we add damage to damage when someone makes a mistake, rather than actually seeking to get to the root of why that person caused harm and working with them to actually prevent it from happening again. And so that punishment approach has an architecture, which is the prison system. But really all of the different aspects that I mentioned have kind of a felt physical presence in our society.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, along that line, sort of getting to some of those sort of examples and strategies, like criminalization has an architecture, particularly for the Black and brown community.
Yeah.
And you tell so many stories and examples. And I think it's so important for people listening to, it's like we all know that there's struggle and we know there's harm and we know there's a lot of it and oppression.
Yeah.
But you tell these really important stories of examples of people that have used like real strategies to create relational, you know, ways of being, safety, care, collective care, community care. So I'm wondering if you want to talk about some of those.
Yeah. I appreciate it. So I talk a fair amount about the work of Devon Bogan and his work at Advance Peace, which is the organization he's now at. The Richmond Office of Neighborhood Safety is the neighborhood initiative, the government office that he created. And, you know, this is something that really came out of a response to violence in the city of Richmond. The city of Richmond around the turn of the century had one of the highest per capita murder rates in the entire country. And the city council, neighbors, everyone was kind of trying to figure out, what do we do about this? How do we respond? And at a city council meeting, Devon suggested that the city create a sort of fellowship program for the young men who were believed to be responsible for the vast majority of homicides in the city of Richmond. And the police, for different reasons, couldn't make the case on these predominantly young men, not exclusively. And Devon said, I want to engage these folks in a program. And there was a lot of skepticism, because they're like, you know, city council's like, wait, you want to start a mentorship program? How is that going to work? But because they had basically tried everything else, folks were like, all right, yeah, let's try it. And it consisted of daily positive mentorship and support from formerly incarcerated folks who are kind of trusted in the community. It consisted of a monthly stipend, so people had some money in their pockets to support themselves and their families, and travel opportunities for these young men to actually kind of broaden their horizons. And one of the things that I think was most important, though, than even the sort of constituent parts, was that Defund really engaged these folks and said, everybody, and from the beginning said, everybody has looked to you all as the problem, has looked to you as the source of what's wrong in the city of Richmond. I want to engage you and hear from you about what's going wrong and how we can move in a different direction. And it was that shift, right, away from isolation towards actually having people participate, right? It was that shift away from deprivation towards actually providing folks with some baseline level of resources.
Yeah.
And it was that shift from a sort of punitive approach, we're going to lock you up and throw away the key, towards a more accountability framework, like not excusing violence, but also engaging folks in an understanding of what led them to commit some of those acts, and also to engage with one another. So one of the cool things that Defund did was that if young people wanted to go sort of out of state or further across the country, they had to go with young men who were from rival neighborhoods, who, as he described it, they believed were trying to kill them. And, you know, through that process of young men coming together, not necessarily, you know, leaving as lifelong friends, but leaving with a level of respect and an understanding of one another that made it so that they would never pick up that gun again, right? And that was a huge shift, not just for those young men, but also for the city of Richmond as a whole, because now mothers and grandmothers could take their kids to the park, and shopkeepers and business owners could keep their stores open longer. And it had this ripple effect across Richmond that I think should be replicated in cities across the country, along with, you know, as President Biden has just said, common sense gun controls and things like that, that we know could also help to address some of the violence that we see gripping our country year after year, and even just this week. So that's like one of the sort of like models that I described, but I also talk about, you know, some of the on-campus work that folks within the PRISM, a group called PRISM, is doing to challenge a culture of gender-based violence on college campuses, which really looks at a kind of holistic framework around how to address gender-based violence from a restorative justice approach, but also from a preventive approach, to really undo some of the normalization of patriarchy, and to create environments where young men can be held accountable, but also still held in community. And for me, that's a key sort of framework, or a way of understanding of what restorative justice is. We still hold people accountable, but they also don't get sort of expelled out of our circle of human concern. And the PRISM model and the work that Devon Bogan did in Richmond, I think, are examples of that kind of approach of like holding folks accountable, but also really holding on to them as part of the human family.
Yeah, this is sort of just coming to me now, just thinking about, you know, I think it's hard for people to believe that actually some of the solutions are as simple as like collective care and belonging and relationship and humanity and humanization, right? And of course, within a structure of also having resources and, you know, other things. And I find myself constantly trying to convince people that this is the answer, right?
Yeah.
Like this is the, I think, you know, I think Van Jones has a little thing in your forward that, you know, the opposite of humanization, of criminalization, is humanization, right?
That's right.
Why is it so hard? Why is it so hard? So hard for people to get their heads around, and wanting proof and wanting the evidence and wanting, you know, the level of the manipulation of fear, the level of the manipulation of hate and othering is so huge.
It is really
and I don't have an answer. It's asked of me all the time, and so I'm like, well, maybe Zach has more clue about, you know, why is it so hard for folks to really feel that?
Yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts as well, because it's a deep question. I would just start by saying, look, this country in many ways was founded in fear. It was founded by folks who were fleeing religious persecution and who brought that fear with them and brought that sort of dualistic way of thinking over with them. And I appreciated this grounding in the fact that we are on Ohlone indigenous land here in the Bay Area. And I've been reading about, just the kind of settler mentality. And part of it is, to me, tied to racism, but it's also deeply tied to patriarchy, right? And we, as men, cisgender men, are not socialized to exhibit our emotions, right? Except for one, which is anger, right? And I talk about Michael Padar's work, Violent No More, Paymar's work, and that I think is playing out. We see it, in terms of the shooting in Atlanta and now the shooting in Boulder, Colorado. There's so many folks who are steeped in ways of being that don't allow for a full expression of our humanity, right? And I don't have, I don't know that I have the answer, but I do think that one thing that gives me hope is that this pandemic has exposed our lack of care for one another, right? In ways that
Right.
even
Absolutely.
average lay people who don't think about prisons all the time or policing, I think when they see, nurses dressed in literal garbage bags, right? At the beginning of the pandemic, when we didn't have basic personal protection equipment, but responding to people demanding racial justice in the streets, you see police with armor gear, like you could barely see their faces, you could barely, touch their actual physical presence. And that to me was this really glaring example of the way in which we haven't created the basic public health infrastructure to keep each other safe, right?
Right.
And so we have always said, like public health solutions to public health issues, drug use and abuse, homelessness, school discipline, a whole host of issues. We never thought we needed to say, you should treat a global pandemic with a public health response, right? But once you've gone way over the deep end and adopted this punitive, othering approach to, I even hesitate to call it safety, to the regulation of your society, right? Once you've adopted that approach, every problem has the same criminalization, othering solution or so-called solution, right? And so Donald Trump went to the same playbook, calling it the Kung flu and so all of these other racist stereotypes and blaming Democratic governors and whoever else he could point the finger at, right? And so that response didn't start 4 years ago when he got elected. It didn't start 40 years ago, although it worsened 40 years ago when we built out this huge prison building boom. It goes all the way back to the origins of our country. And I think, some of what I lay out in the book is that these concepts of restorative justice don't just work for individuals, but also we need to figure out how we can look at them as societal wide responses that we need to take up to really heal the harm that we've experienced in this country.
Yeah. There's like 7 directions of questions I could ask you. No, it's so great. But I'm going to go with this one because I know it's so up and it's so live and it's personal for all of us, right? And it's personal for me too. Just take a minute to sort of say something a little bit more personally about some of the anti-Asian violence that's kind of happening, and then ask you to put it in some context. But so as a South Asian person, which I know is different from sort of what the experience of East Asians are going through right now, but when I have been watching what's been happening and I sort of started to notice things coming up for me and I dug a little deeper, I realized that there was just this lineage of anti-immigrant that I felt my whole life, that my
Yeah.
parents have felt, this feeling that we are okay to be belittled, to be made fun of, to be shoved to the side,
Yeah.
we're kind of weird, we don't talk right, there are all kinds of, we eat strange foods, like,
Yeah.
and there's almost like a visceral disgust that some people feel for our actual
Yeah.
presence. So we should come in through, the help, the back door, all, especially if you're a woman. The watching the sort of shoving of the elder man
Yeah.
was really like a visceral replication of the shoving that we feel on the
Yeah.
side of oppression, of like really being shoved to
Yeah.
the side. And the way that those women who were killed in Atlanta almost made less than because they were maybe confused with sex workers.
Yeah.
And just this whole way, like the what you're talking about the lies,
Yeah.
the suspicion of immigrants, all of that. I don't know if I have a question. I think I'm just like,
Yeah.
I
No.
know it's up, and then there's
Yeah.
what happened in Colorado, and it's up,
Yeah.
and I guess we're just talking,
Yeah,
And
no, I
my kids are at
appreciate
the
that.
vigil right now in Oakland, and I'm like,
Right on.
yeah. And
Yeah.
it just would love for you to talk more about what you're thinking about all
Yeah.
these things that are going on right now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking and I'm also listening. I want to read the words of Kimberly Crenshaw, who said in regards to the murders in Atlanta, to say the murderers' actions were about sexual desire and therefore not about race is a fundamental intersectional failure. It denies the racial dimensions of the hypersexualization of Asian women and reproduces the environment that makes Asian women particularly vulnerable to harassment, abuse, and murder, right? And I think some of what, I have failed as a cisgendered man is as in recognizing some of those intersections, right? She describes in an article that she wrote, like you wouldn't go to an intersection where cars are often colliding and only view what's happening from one direction of that traffic, right? And so understanding the way in which Asian women have been particularly targeted through this rise of anti-Asian violence is particularly important. And it's important on all levels of our society, right? There's the Donald Trump and his sort of big bullhorn racism, right? But there's also what this current administration is doing as it relates to its view of China and the way in which our foreign policy continues to put folks in that box that you described, right? That otherized, sort of up to no good, like all of those tropes that have been applied to a number of different groups inside the United States. But I think that really understanding, understanding the way in which the actions of one individual are really symptomatic of larger societal ails, and that we actually need to think about both if we are going to be successful, right? And I think sometimes, as people who know a little bit about restorative justice, like in just common conversations, people are like, but what do you do about this situation, right? And you're supposed to like answer how to respond to, hateful violence in 30 seconds, right? And it's really more complex than that. But I hope that, the conversation that we're having gives people an opportunity to think about our immigration policy, our foreign policy, and to find their lane and their role in really addressing ongoing othering and marginalization of communities.
Absolutely. I think what I appreciated reading your book is you do really a stellar job of putting interpersonal harm in the context of structural harms. And as a person, coming from the restorative justice world that is, has been rightly so criticized for its focus on just interpersonal harm, is really important. And what I think you do this job of not denying the experience of interpersonal harm while putting it in the context of structural harm, and then making all of these connections to, where, between, the suffering of someone who lost his son in California Youth Authority and then suffered from the healthcare industry. You make incredible connections of like, look, this is how it's all connected, right? This is how rape on campus is connected to homelessness. This is how, and I think one of the problems we have in sort of social justice communities, and even just the way we see this, is we don't make those broader connections. We don't work simultaneously on policy as we work on the interpersonal piece and get kind of pigeonholed and stuck into something.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think like what your comment sparked for me is the way in which the framework of fear, it are these structural elements, but it's also very personal, right? And so some of what fear does to us biologically is it has us rely on our reptilian brain, which is the oldest part of the brain, right? It's the fight or flight part of the brain. And so, when people are faced with these tremendously terrible harms, it's natural for us to really kind of go knee-jerk reaction. But one of the things that I hope to try to do in the book is to ask us to kind of take a step back and to hear some stories that might challenge your understanding of how we get to safety. And so one, I want to, if it's okay, like tell one of those stories, because you mentioned Darrell Feaster and his father, Alan Feaster. And Darrell was a 14-year-old kid who was getting in trouble in school, and he, was doing stuff that adolescents do. As I'm finding out with my 11-year-old daughter, right? Rebelling against authority and responding to his dad in ways that his dad didn't like, cutting school. He ended up, being sent to a group home for being truant, some, hundreds of miles across California. His dad didn't have a car, couldn't visit him. He ends up, Darrell, stealing a car with someone else from the group home, gets arrested for doing so, sent to another, still more remote youth prison in the California Youth Authority youth prison system. And Darrell and his cellmate, Dion Whitfield, after, nearly 18 months of continuous isolation inside of their cell, were found hanged in their cell and had died. And I met Alan, his dad, at the shoe shine stand where he worked in San Francisco, and just got to hear him describe, as he was shining somebody's shoes, like what happened to his son, who his son was. And over time got to know Alan and understand the level of commitment that he had. And that he basically said, even though my son died, I am going to adopt every single young person inside the California Youth Authority youth prison system, and we are going to work to close these youth prisons down. And that's exactly what we did. We organized mostly mothers and grandmothers. Alan and so many others just came week after week, month after month to Sacramento, and weren't dissuaded by the responses of legislators who said, wait, you want to close these youth prison down? And we said, yes, we absolutely want to close them down, because this isn't just the experience of Darrell and Dion. 3 out of 4 young people are being rearrested within 1 year. Kids were spending weeks, if not months on end in isolation. The state was spending $150,000 per year per young person on this youth authority youth prison system. And what was impactful wasn't necessarily those statistics, but really shifting from criminalization to humanization, right? In the ways that you described and that Van lifted up. Because what we did was we brought formerly incarcerated young people, we brought their mothers and their grandmothers, and it was that work of actually helping legislators kind of disabuse themselves of some of those stereotypes, the youth super predator stereotype and the welfare queen stereotype that was so front of mind at that time. And through that process, we moved a few legislators to introduce legislation to close down the youth prisons. Even though some of that legislation wasn't successful, other legislative efforts were that restricted the number of young people who could go into the youth prison system. And over a near decade-long campaign, we closed 5 of 8 youth prisons across the state of California. And just recently, the governor signed legislation to close the remaining 3 youth prisons in a phased out manner over the next few years. And guess what? Youth crime continued to decline as we were closing those youth prisons down. And that is a huge part of what I wanted to leave, with folks who are listening, is that when we actually treat people with dignity and respect, it actually enhances public safety rather than the opposite. And that's the thing that, I think we want to hold on to and really lift up and do our best to try to move people from that fearful space to say, here's what I've seen work over time. And it's not going to be an overnight switch, right? It's not going to be, we move from, being the nation that locks up more people than any other country to all of a sudden just being a restorative justice paradise, right? But just as we decided to, shift away from a sort of fossil fuel dependence to actually move towards a cleaner energy infrastructure, we can decide to move away from this punitive framework of fear towards a more care-based public health approach to safety. And I think, the youth prison story is a good example of how that's possible.
Yeah, the youth prison story is an amazing example of how that's possible, and just the work that you all did, and the same families, the same Black families, criminalized, and having the young people criminalized, to really organizing and making that happen is a really incredible story.
Right
I'm
on.
curious about
And can I just say
oh
one
yeah,
more thing
you
quickly?
can say many more things. You can say all the things.
One of the things that I appreciated about your retelling of the story is that you also told a little bit about Alan, and I told a little bit about Alan too, but part of what kind of brought Alan back to my attention was just riding the BART train years later and seeing Alan on BART, and we had kind of lost touch and kind of got back in touch. And I learned that he was suffering from cancer, and it was just another reminder of the lack of care in our society, right? And the way in which, if we had a more preventative actual healthcare system, right? And so many people I've read who know about the healthcare system really describe it as a sick care system rather than a healthcare system, right? Mm-hmm. It's responding to folks after they've been diagnosed with real ailments rather than, and this is starting to change somewhat, but we really need to focus on a more preventative approach to healthcare, which models, in my mind, how we need to adopt a more preventative approach to safety as well. And so some of what the book does is not just track Darrell's story, and not even just track Darrell and Alan's story, because I talk about, well, what if rather than sending Darrell to some remote group home, what if you actually provided a social worker in the home to support Alan, who's a struggling working class dad, and Darrell? That would be much less expensive than a group home, let alone a youth prison. What if we actually invested in the kind of preventive care that says, well, Alan is, of the demographic that is particularly susceptible to these kinds of cancers, and how is his diet going, and how is his, those are the kinds of things that I think we could be doing or not doing. And we have a political power problem that I think we'll need to overcome in order to shift that dynamic. But I think it's 100% doable if we start looking at the right levers and moving those levers in the right directions.
Totally. Yeah. I had two questions. I think
Yeah.
I'm going to try to remember them both.
Okay, sorry.
No, it's all good. And we're just flowing with it. So I think the first one was around like post George Floyd, not even post, but in the wake of a series of police state sanctioned killings, in the wake
Yeah.
of that, in the wake of uprisings and continued uprisings,
Yeah.
and the fact that we've all failed, myself included, in the humanization of Black communities and Black families and Black
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
Do you feel at all like the needle has moved at all? Do you feel any sense of like, oh, people see us, we're a little more humanized, or do you not? And I'm just curious if you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. It's a hard question for me to answer right this moment. I think I was telling you before, something happened to me a few weeks ago that related to policing that I think is a story I want to share because it's indicative of a larger point that I want to make. And so I had went with a friend and my partner and my kids kind of to celebrate, I think we were kind of celebrating his birthday. He's darker skinned African-American friend of mine. We went on this long hike. We're coming back through Walnut Creek. And it's nighttime by now. And first there's like one cop car, and then I think there's two. And I pull over and I'm like, oh, they're really after somebody, because I think I see three cop cars. But they're not moving from behind me. They don't have their sirens on. So I go through the next intersection. My daughter's like, I think they're after us, Daddy. You need to pull over. So I do, and stop. And then I hear, roll your windows down, throw your keys out the window, come out with your hands up. And uh, and so I'm, trying to navigate these different signals. And I'm like, because actually the first thing they said was roll your window down and stick your hands out the window, which is what I did. And then they said, throw your key, and I'm having a hard time remembering the exact sequence of events, but I'm thinking to myself, but if I reach back into the car, what's going to happen to grab my keys? Then I throw them out the window. Then I get out of the car. My hands are up, is lift your shirt up, which I do to, up to my chest. And I'm spinning, I'm turning around slowly. And then they say, back up with your hands up. And I'm doing all of these things. And I notice as I'm backing up away from my car that my license plate is actually different than my license plate. And so as I'm kneeling down on the ground, they're putting handcuffs on me, and then they take me to the car. I say to the officer, I think someone stole our license plate. So I didn't realize totally until I'm down on my knees that there are like probably 7 to 10 different guns pointed at me, and that my kids in the backseat are watching this whole ordeal. And part of what happened for me through this incident is, like, long story short, they take my friend out of the car, they handcuffed him. My daughter are taken out of the car. My partner is taken out of the car. And through this process, I start to think about all of the different ways, even as I'm sitting in the car, this could be going wrong. And thankfully, the things are not happening. One of the officers comes back to me and says, after asking me a bunch of other questions, says, we think we figured this out. There's a car that has your license plate. Someone has swapped your license plate. We pulled you over based on the license plate readers here in Walnut Creek. And he, after a few more minutes, lets me out of the car, unhandcuffs me, and I say, can I go to my kids? My kids run over to me. They're bawling, they're crying, they're hugging me. And another one of the officers comes, and he says something to my older daughter, like, I'm also an older brother. Thanks for taking care of your little sister. We're sorry, and kind of, says something that has me label him as a good cop, right? Like, okay, this is someone who did something decent. Another cop who was kind of more gruff and abrupt, had a stars and stripes bandana across his face that didn't give me a lot of comfort. I sort of labeled in my mind as kind of a bad cop. But fundamentally, like, as I've been thinking about this story and reflecting on it, like, I don't think it's about good cops or bad cops. It's really about the way in which we've deployed police officers in our society to protect a society that is fundamentally unjust, right? And so we deploy cops when workers are demanding a fair wage, and they never intervene on the behalf of workers, right? It's always on behalf of owners. We deploy cops. We did a civil disobedience at a school board meeting and got beat up by police officers at a school board meeting in Oakland. And to me, it was indicative of the way in which, when people are demanding fairness and justice, it's often the police who are responding, and not in ways that amplify or enlarge the possibility of marginalized folks. And so one of the things that gives me hope is that there's starting to be, I think, a more structural analysis of these problems, where people are able to depersonalize it a little bit more. As someone who has a ton of law enforcement, people who work in law enforcement in my own family, it's important for me to not, demonize or otherize people on either side of the bars, right? I don't want to demonize my cousins who are locked up. I don't want to demonize my uncles and cousins who have worked in various capacities in law enforcement. And I see that there is starting to be this kind of more global picture understanding of policing, and the need to shift resources away from only first responders who are armed and wear badges. Why would we send people who are in military gear to respond to someone who is suicidal, right? We should be sending people who are trained mental health workers. And that level of analysis, more so than structural racism, I still feel like we have a long way to go. But I think from a sort of conceptual framework, I'm starting to see more traction than I have in the past.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for sharing something that's more recent. And, it's again how these things hit us really personally, and then putting it in the context of everything around. So appreciate that a lot. I feel like so, you when we talk about like these real things, these real strategies of how to create a culture and of care, a collective care mechanism. And I agree with you. I also feel like I'm seeing more traction around crisis counselors instead of law enforcement, the move towards changing resources, moving resources from policing to mental health and crisis counseling, and hopefully street-oriented crisis counseling and community guardians, not the mental health industrial complex.
That's right.
Because that's also a whole system that otherizes, as opposed to just like the Devons of the world who know how to get down in the street and be like, are you okay? And what do you need? And I'm your people, right? And so really having people understand the relevance of that. There was something else that you mentioned that I loved.
Just one thing I want to say about, just one thing I want to say to illustrate what you were just saying, if that's okay.
Please.
We experience this in terms of, like, you mentioned the distinction between people who are known and trusted in the community and who can respond to harm in ways that are appropriate understanding, culturally competent obviously gets overused, but versus a sort of, kind of clinical and or just bureaucratic approach to safety. And for me, one example of the difference between the two is we fought long and hard to move some of Alameda County's resources away from the sheriff and probation department and towards kind of what we believe should be community-based reentry supports for people coming out of the jail. Quick context is that the state had been sued as a result of overcrowding in prisons. So the state of California says, we have too many people in prisons, people convicted of less serious offenses. Counties, you're now going to deal with these folks, and gave counties a bunch of money in the tens of millions of dollars to respond to these folks. And most counties were giving all of the resources to the sheriff and probation departments. And so we, did the civil disobedience. We went to the board of supervisors, and finally we were able to move resources towards away from the sheriff and probation department towards public health approach. Now, what happened was a lot of the contracts that went out in the RFPs were quickly snatched up by the entities who knew how to write the RFPs and to be responsive to the RFPs more than they knew how to be responsive to communities, right? And so part of what we decided to do in that moment is really go back to the drawing board and say, what do people who are directly impacted by violence in communities, who are survivors of crime and also who have survived criminal court systems, what are they saying about what's needed in this moment? And people lifted up restorative justice from, by folks who are trusted in the community. They lifted up economic opportunity in the Bay Area. They lifted up really people being able to stay in their homes as being intimately tied to community safety. And so what we tried to do is embody all of those things in a physical building that we call Restore Oakland, that is located in the Fruitvale, one of the most diverse neighborhoods within a super diverse city of Oakland. And we're really trying to put forward what community safety looks like when it's actually done in the interest of community members. And Restore Oakland houses a dedicated space for restorative justice, a restaurant that'll be run by formerly incarcerated folks and others who have been locked out of opportunity. But it also just going to host some damn good organizing to make sure that people have an opportunity to participate and to shift budgets in ways that actually reach communities. And that work of supporting folks and providing folks with services, but also the means to really change the conditions inside of Oakland in the Bay Area, we believe is fundamental to safety. And we really wanted to lift up like a physical example of what community safety looks like, partly because, to bring it back to how we started, when people hear the term public safety, oftentimes they think of prisons or handcuffs or policing, even though our felt understanding of safety is different than that. And so we really wanted to provide a kind of a visual aid, if you will, in terms of demonstrating a different way forward for safety. And I think it's an example of like that shift away from a sort of clinical, public health approach, the RFPs that are responded by the same old players, to actually, having a responsive approach that is grounded in community needs.
Yeah, totally. Added to that, there's a moment in your book that you talk about this idea in smaller communities about that smaller communities, let's say Indigenous communities, came from having these multiplex relationships, right? Where people had various relationships with each other. So maybe if the person I bought my bread from was also my student, and his mother was also the person who cut my flowers. And so we have, I'm getting to this notion of like how we create collective responsibility and interdependence in urban 2021, right? And not in these, we're not in the small communities, but I love the notion of the multiplex, relationships that cause us to want to deal with harm and conflict. And so when you translate that to 2021 and you're talking about, you started talking about how some things like engagement, right? Like political
Mhm.
engagement, book clubs, like engaging actually can
Mhm.
create this same sense of collective responsibility or
Yeah.
interdependence. Because I think it's really deep for us to get to the point
Yeah.
where we have to almost like do behavioral change to
Yeah.
realize that we are interdependent and we are collectively
Yeah.
responsible.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to
Yeah.
like, what do you think we do in 2021 to
Yeah.
create that?
No, I really appreciate that. Like, uh, for me, and this will be obvious to you as an expert in restorative justice, but for the sake of the audience, I feel like you and I are just talking, but I know that there are people watching and
Yeah, go
listening,
for it.
like,
Go for it. I've avoided the term restorative justice this whole time because
yes.
I told you if I never say the word again, I'll be happy. But
Yes,
you got to break some
I
stuff
I get
down.
to go. Okay.
You go.
So, I think that our court system is emblematic of that same, divisive way of thinking, right? Is the person who's caused harm on one side, the person who's been harmed on the other, and they're all lawyered up, and the judge sort of decides, and then the person who's caused harm is, if in the criminal court system, is sent to some remote prison, right? Restorative justice is completely different than that. The person who's caused harm, the person who's been harmed are sat in a circle. They're surrounded by the people that support them. And every single person in that circle is really thinking about the question of what might I have done to prevent this harm from happening, right? And so there's this way in which that gives folks an opportunity to think about interdependence, to think about mutual accountability. And that framework absolutely works, right? People who have caused harm are much less likely to recidivate if they go through a restorative justice process than the criminal court system. Victims of crime, survivors of crime report much higher satisfaction rates with restorative justice processes because they can see the accountability that has happened, they feel it, and it impacts them. And finally, all of those folks who are in the circle surrounding those two individuals also benefit from restorative justice because we're collectively developing this accountability muscle where we are dealing with those hard questions. We're not just having the knee-jerk responses. We're really thinking about our own accountability. And to me, it gives us an opportunity to really build the muscle of holding the powerful folks accountable, whether it be a powerful restaurant owner who is sexually harassing women and gender nonconforming folks in their restaurant, or allowing that culture to flourish in their restaurant, whether or not it be politicians at the state, national, or local level, right? And so really developing this framework where we can see how our actions are tied to one another, but also be in the practice of dealing with some thorny questions that would enable us to really bring these questions not just to the most marginal folk, the folks who have been most marginalized, but really to the folks who are the most powerful. And I think that is, if anything, going to have the most ripple effects when we start to see powerful people held accountable in ways that aren't about, necessarily ostracization or, ending, their lives, but really about really demonstrating that everybody is part of this interdependent framework, and therefore everyone should be held accountable, and it's our responsibility collectively to do so.
Yeah. Yay. Yes, absolutely. I want to just ask one more question and then we're going to do a kind of Q&A part.
Sure.
And it's kind of, I want to just dial back to sort of the topic of like sexual harm and domestic violence for a minute. And, and kind of come at this from a personal place of like, I know I am a deeply, interrelated, interdependent, like come from like deep in my gut, solidarity place. But one thing that gets difficult for me is when I don't feel that like patriarchy is seen in the same way that other systems as equal to other systems of deep inequity, or when sexual harm and domestic violence are kind of seen as the brushed off non-real harms, I go like, I start to feel like, well, if you don't see me, how do I stay in solidarity with you? If you don't see me, how do I stay in solidarity? How do I hold on to my interdependence? And then I notice myself being like, well, then I'm not going to see you either. And, I mean, this is like a decolonizing question, right? Like in my gut, in my soul, I want to stay in solidarity. But when particularly, silence is endemic to, violence against women, and then you don't feel seen, and I can imagine if we turn that around and we're talking about violence on Black communities, and then Black communities continue to be humanized by people like me, there's this kind of like, well, you don't see me. So I'm just like, and it's, we know the strategy of divide and conquer and crabs in a barrel and all of that, but I think there's something really so deeply like personal about how to like decolonize and stay in relationship. I know for me, I really lean on my spiritual practice and like the causes and conditions and the deep fundamental nature of reality that helps me to get out of an ugly place. And I'm just curious for you, and maybe for others, like what are some of your practices or strategies to sort of stay in solidarity?
No, I really appreciate that question. I think, one thing I would just name is like, I have really tried to own my own privilege as it relates, and not always successfully for sure, but as it relates to being a light-skinned African-American and understanding that my experience is different than my father's experience, understanding. And so I think part of it, because patriarchy was so deeply ingrained in me as a young person, recognizing that it's harder for me to overcome it. Like I have more work to do as a cisgendered man than I do in the context of other forms of privilege that I occupy and inhabit. And I think that when I have been thrown off by folks not seeing or not recognizing me, I have tried to, just, I'm an introverted person, if you can't tell based on the on the conversation thus far. And so some of it is just going to remember that care in a broader sense actually starts with some level of self-care, right? And that in the context of social justice is also a little bit contrary to a lot of our culture, right? Which is kind of a burnout culture and a work as hard as you can. And so some of what I've recognized is that when I take care of myself, I have more capacity to be there for others, even when I don't necessarily feel like they're showing up for me in the ways that I would like them to. But to be honest, like, I think you're right. Like, I think we need to do a lot more work. Some of what I describe in the book is the way in which our economic system continues to undergird patriarchy, and so many, so it's about violence and it's about harm, but it's also about really structural levels of capitalism that reinforce the undervaluing of women and their labor in ways that facilitate their exploitation through a violence framework, or not framework, just their subjection to violent harm, right? So let me be more clear. My partner runs an organization called One Fair Wage, and she describes the way in which the levels of sexual harassment in the restaurant industry are higher in states that maintain a sub-minimum wage. So most restaurant workers are women, and in the states where women are more reliant on tips, they also have to put up with all kinds of sexual violence and harm.
Right.
and so that kind of structural analysis is something that I think should be more broadly in our consciousness, is not as yet. And I think that, you know, we need to get better at doing the work that Kimberly Crenshaw really helped illuminate in terms of really recognizing these intersections and lifting them up and calling each other in when we don't do well. So, you know, I wrote a blog about what happened in Atlanta, and, you know, I had written part of it prior to actually what happened in Atlanta and the murder of predominantly Asian women in Atlanta. And it didn't actually meet the mark in terms of being intersectional in some of the ways that I described. And I was talking with a friend and colleague about that, and they kind of pointed it out and say, hey, you didn't really pick this up. And so I just appreciated that. And I hope that, you know, we can try to be graceful with one another. And if we can't, take a nap, you know, go take a nap, go eat some snacks. You know, we've been trying to have a better snack policy at the Ella Baker Center, and I tell you, it's been game changing. So yeah, those are some things that I think: snacks, naps, and intersectionality.
Snacks, naps, and intersectionality sounds like the name of your next book. It's the best. We have a couple questions for you. Yeah, really appreciate you. This is a question from Grace. I'm listening in from New Zealand, and I'm doing my PhD on prison abolition and reconceptualizing safety. We often fear what we don't understand. How do we encourage a connection between people who live in different lives, parentheses, based on culture, cultural, ethnic, class, etc. differences, so that we can create a culture of care?
Oh, that is a deep question.
Yeah.
Well, as speaking as a resident of white settler nation, as are you, I think it really does go back to that. And part of the reason I say that is just because I have been doing some reading about experience of indigenous people in California of late. And so that's at the top of my brain. But one of the things that I read recently that was helpful for me is, like, you know, we just haven't seen each other, right? Yeah. So white folks arrived to California with a history and practice of expulsion of Native people, a genocidal practice across the nation. And they arrived to a place that is amazingly abundant in terms of the animals and the plant life and the and the assumption is that this is just wilderness, right? That this is just a big open space, and John Muir describes it as beautiful Yosemite. Let's preserve, you know, this wilderness, or let's exploit it. And so those are the kind of two options. And, you know, and mostly is the exploitation happens more than the conservation, right? And so all kinds of plant life and animal life decimated in that first, you know, 30 years of American settlement. What folks didn't realize is, you know, for over 10,000 years, indigenous people have been carefully stewarding the lands in which they live. They knew, you know, from a ethno, you know, I don't even know all the words because I'm not a biologist or a botanist or any of those things, but they understood the world around them in ways that allowed them to continue to support ongoing life and to allow for that abundance to not just continue, but to be sort of amplified. And so I do think that we have to go all the way back, especially in countries that are founded in colonialism and racialized and gender-based violence, to not just recognize folks across these chasms that have been created based on patriarchy and white supremacy, right? And so the care for each other and for our natural environment is something that is diminished as being feminine, right? And we have to actually create societies that take that up. I don't know what the right word is. We have to, see each other, not just currently, but across these historical lens that would, historical viewpoints that would allow us to begin to repair some of those harms. And that's not going to happen overnight. But what I've seen is that we can do the daily sort of policy work in the context of like a campaign to shift away from youth prisons to, more restorative approaches. And as we do that work, we can begin to seed some of those longer trajectory conversations. And I've seen that be successful in places like Chicago that, moved forward a reparations framework around some of the police violence that happened in Chicago. So it's not short-term work. It's really work that I think will take some time, but I think I'm starting to see some openness towards really re-examining our history in ways that I think will allow us to imagine a different future together.
Absolutely. Another question is, what can I do locally and beyond to support community care / community safety practices and programs like the examples you've shared?
Right on. I really appreciate that. So one, I would say Night Out for Safety and Liberation. That's an annual event that we do in the first Tuesday of August. And it is an event where we have neighbors come out and really reclaim community safety, but in a way that is not driven by a police-centric narrative, like you're the eyes and ears of the police. We like to say that people have more than eyes and ears. We have hearts, we have hands, we have minds. And so neighbors are coming out that first Tuesday in August. You can go to nosl.us to learn more. That's nosl.us to learn more about the events that will happen this year. And let that be the sort of, I use terrible analogies, but gateway drug for you to to enter into thinking about safety and advocating for a more holistic vision of safety in a different way. Because once you've started to talk with your neighbors, rather than, just scrolling through the app and saying, I see someone who I don't recognize in my neighborhood, I'm going to call the police. Maybe you start to have discussions with your neighbors about, hey, this is what I'm noticing is happening. Do you notice that? What do you think we can do? And I've been involved in those conversations with people in Oakland who are like, yeah, we've been having our packages stolen from our building. How do we think about what we could do without necessarily just, calling for more police on our street, and instead, looking at maybe the security inside of our building? Could we put packages in a different place? Could we also think about, who's living around the corner from us? Can we look at gentrification in Oakland and the ways in which inequality is expanding, and really be advocates for the city at the city council level for a redirection of resources? So, really starting with what's happening in your building, but really understanding it in these kind of, both depth and breadth ways, so that we can start to have the harder conversations that we need to. But there are, community-based organizations. I'm not sure where the questioner is from, but there are amazing community-based organizations. NOSL.us is a national event, so you can get connected to a number of organizations through that event as well.
Yeah, that's great. Another question is, how can we work on a personal level of change? How can we work on a personal level to change our own fear reactions? That's a really good one.
Meditation.
Snacks,
naps,
and
naps, and a little bit of breathing. I think look, fear is a natural human response, right? And so I never encourage people to not be afraid, because I'm afraid. Everybody is afraid. That's normal and natural. I think what we want to be able to try to get to is some level of choice between when we're afraid and how we respond to it. And I think also as a society, when people are directly impacted as survivors of crime, we want to engage them as part of the conversation in what should happen. But we also want to have that conversation not exclusively be driven by a kind of knee-jerk reaction. And so one of the things that I'm super excited about is the work of the Alliance for Safety and Justice and Californians for Safety and Justice, who have brought together a network of survivors of crime to really broadcast that people are thinking about crime in different ways as folks who have been directly impacted, and calling for more holistic and long-term solutions. So I don't know if that totally answers the question, but I think that, that's a very personal question. And I think that there are a lot of different ways that we can really remind ourselves. But the thing that has been most helpful for me personally, and maybe I should just speak from that perspective, is trying to develop greater self-awareness, which for me has come through, doing some meditation, participating in this amazing organizational work. There's an organization called the Black Organizing for Leadership and Dignity, which trains organizing, or BOLD, that trains organizers on just kind of self-awareness, among other kind of modalities. So I'll stop talking there.
No, you should keep talking. I was going to add I think something you said before about, I think something about these fear reactions are particularly when we're talking about fear of others, of communities of color, of Black people, is to really trace back a lineage of all the assumptions of what you've been told, all the narratives, all the lies, all of the history, like from the deepest level of your thinking, oh, I actually thought that, and be honest with yourself, ourselves. I actually thought that about somebody, and be able to own what we've thought about others. And I think that begins a really different process of self-awareness and humanizing, and
No, that's absolutely right. Look, I went to the fanciest universities this country has to offer, and I learned mostly nothing inside of them in terms of challenging a long history of patriarchy and racism, with the exception of a few classes. Shout out to Cornell West and the African American Introduction to African American Studies.
Well, if it's Cornell West, then
there you go. You go. But for the most part, a lot of my for real deal education about that really in a lot of ways was unlearning. A lot of that was at the Ella Baker Center, at the Labor Community Center for at other community-based organizations. And that is also where I began to engage the world. And I think the other part of the analysis is that you have to step out and really be involved and engaged, like your kids attending the vigil, and that engagement is critical. If we have to be in the practice of unlearning, it can't just be theoretical. And
then I'm going to get to the next question. I think it was back to a previous question. Whenever people ask me also oh, how do I get involved? I know people are also looking for ways out of isolation into belonging. And that there is something about engagement and being involved, that really does create belonging. And as you then pointed back out in your book, actually creates a culture of care, like the act of actually coming out of isolation, choosing to get involved, choosing to get others involved, showing up, being happy, and actually you can do it with joy. Even in struggle, when I'm around another 150 crying people, I feel pretty damn happy.
That's right.
Because I'm with the other 150 people, feeling it together, and there's a kind of sense of peace and belonging that comes from that. So just to add that too.
One of the ways we name it is as healing through action, right? That there's an opportunity, whether or not you're the mom of a young person who's in the youth prison, or someone who's responding to anti-Asian violence against women, the act of actually coming out, being together, and doing what we love in the face of oppression. Because let's be honest, this country has its oppressive moments and modalities, right? And so I remember one of the times when I felt like my spirit opened was as a young person, being like 18 years old. This is even before I found the Ella Baker Center. We were pushing back against Proposition 21, which was an initiative to lock up more youth of color, to make it easier to label youth of color as being gang involved. And we did this protest right in front of the Oakland Police Department and really took over this whole intersection. And I'm sitting in the middle of this intersection, looking up, and we had taken over the whole intersection so I could just sit down and draw a picture. And I was just drawing a picture of the stoplight. And instead of saying, no left turn, I made it say no on Prop 21 in my drawing, right? And I still feel like it's one of my best works of art. I just feel like, there's something about like being able to say, you know what, I am still going to do the things that motivate me. I'm still going to find love in community. And that to me is really the best medicine and frankly, the best opportunity for us to achieve the kind of collective medicine and change that we need.
Yeah, wonderful. Just like, I think 2 more questions. This one is, how can I talk to my conservative pro-police family members who are alienated by progressive ideas? How do you try to connect with different audiences who are not immediately open to restorative justice, let alone defunding police?
Yeah, no, I think trusted messengers is a thing that isn't just true among right. communities,
yes.
or sort of like progressive folks, or it's also true in the context of across communities. And so I would refer you to organizations like LEAP, I want to say, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, for example, where there are former law enforcement officers who are talking about the need to shift their approach, who recognize that, hey, we can't arrest our way out of these problems. Point you to even police chiefs themselves. Like there's a police chief in Burlington, Vermont, who I write about in the book, who was seeing just so many people coming in with overdoses due to opiates, and decided that not only was he going to do some advocacy, but he was actually going to do some advocacy with the hospitals. So he went to the hospitals and said, this seems to be your protocol. We actually don't believe that that's the right protocol. We should be and basically like helped create more of a buffer so that the criminalization wasn't the first response, but actually the care was the first response. And that was partly because that police chief could see his family members and those who were impacted by the opioid crisis and epidemic. And I say that to say, like, there are examples where people are adopting a more public health approach across communities. The first thing to say is to say, these approaches work and here's the evidence. The challenge becomes that people don't believe that those approaches are appropriate for folks in other communities, right? And that's where that othering happens. And that's a longer conversation that involves, I think, exposure to people of other communities, that involves, like having some of those hard conversations, and really trying to gauge whether or not people will kind of meet you halfway. And also, I think, protecting some of your own safety and sanity, right? Because there's, what you can do and there's knowing what you can't. And, maybe it isn't that one uncle, maybe it's, talking to your cousins and choosing your battles. But I think that there's a lot we can do when we focus on, communities that are impacted by these issues in different ways, and not forgetting that each and every one of us are impacted by an over-reliance on punishment and prisons that COVID-19 shows, but also the roads and the potholes. You know, one of my co-founders at Justice for Families who's a white woman from Southwest Louisiana, would talk about when she was talking with some of her community members and folks, was just like, look, if you have potholes in your streets, if your schools are dilapidated, that is related to this over reliance on incarceration in the state of Louisiana and other southern states and places across the country. So I think that there are different angles, and quite frankly, I think we need to use all of them, because as we've talked about, so much of this framework of fear is really acculturated inside the United States.
Yeah, amazing. Last question, and then we'll just do a little closing
Sure.
piece. Is just, this is a question from several audience members. How can those of us with privilege work most effectively to advocate for radical compassion for all people, including the most marginalized?
Well, I'm assuming that if we're most privileged, we also have some level of resources. So I think like leveraging those resources to support organizations that are pushing for a transformative approach to safety and security inside the United States is important. I think that leveraging your relationships with elected officials, because so often elected officials are saying, well, I'm really responding to my constituents who are saying they need more safety, the same kind of safety approaches. Even in the story in terms of Walnut Creek, my understanding is that part of the reason why they have all of these new fancy technologies and an increased police presence in Walnut Creek is partly in response to racial justice uprisings, right? So there weren't enough people who were saying, no, we don't actually want to respond to, you know, the demands for racial justice with more policing. That's actually the opposite of the point that people are making in calling for more accountability. We want to respond with a different approach. And so leveraging your relationships, your resources, and listening, I think is the last thing I would say, is really putting yourself in places where you can hear from people who have been impacted by decades, if not centuries, of a punitive approach to safety and a fear-based approach to understanding our society. Yeah, and then go to elevatorcenter.org
Yeah.
and check out our work, and also, you know, go and Google Sonya Shah, who I'm sure you already know, and support the work of the collective, the Ahimsa Collective. Am I saying that right?
Yeah,
Okay,
you
just
are.
making sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, that's so sweet. Ahimsa is a Sanskrit word that means non-harm and non-injury. So we're really up each other's alleys right now.
Right on.
Yeah, so let's just, you know, kind of do a little checkout, you know, see if there's any kind of closing thoughts or feelings or anything you want to say, anything we want to say before ending. So just to give you a moment, because I know you've been talking a lot. Yeah, I just want to really thank you for your work. You know, it's interesting. It's so great for me because I never get to read anymore. And so before an interview like this, I get to read this book. And I really, really I felt like for like 4 days, I was just like swimming in the words that you wrote, and really felt, like I said, a little bit more connected to the history of like Richmond and Oakland and just places. I felt like there were little pieces that like weren't about restorative justice, were other strategies towards safety, and all the examples that you gave that actually were really helpful for me on another level, on a more professional, I guess, level. And just, yeah, really appreciating thinking about all these things. So that's what I want to say to close.
Okay,
I was just giving you lots of appreciation and love. Yeah, you're cutting me off, trying to make me stop appreciating you. Gotta just take it all in. Just take it all in. Okay, take it in. Whew. Have some snacks, take a nap, you know, all that stuff. So I thank you very much, and just want to turn it over to you. See if there's anything you want to say.
No, I thank you so much, Sonya. I would just say, let's keep breathing, let's keep doing the work. And let's keep responding from the love that's in our hearts, right? And I think when we start with that perspective in place, that we have an opportunity to be successful. And, if I believed my rational brain when I first started this work, I probably would not have done it, right? If I listened to all of the hate and fear that was being broadcast around youth super predators as I was a high school student and a college student, if I had succumbed to that, I would have never started this work. And we have achieved incredible progress. And so I want to just leave that with folks. Like, as much as we've talked about the ways in which these systems are acculturated, I've seen just incredible progress in terms of really moving away from a framework of fear, and people really understanding that we need to take care of one another if we're going to take care of safety. And so I'm inspired despite a lot of challenges. I hope that you are as well. And I hope that you take the time to take one action coming out of this conversation, be it large, be it small, that you can say help shift us in the direction of taking care of one another.
Thank you so much, Zach. And thanks to CIS, and I'm going to turn it over to Alex for some closing words.
Thank you so much for attending this evening. We hope you will join us for more of our upcoming talks and workshops. This conversation was recorded tonight, so if you would like to watch it again or share it with your community, it will be available on our YouTube channel at this same link and later on our Facebook page. We will also feature this talk on our podcast, which you can find at www.ciispod.com or by searching CIIS Public Programs on your favorite podcast app. Thanks again for joining us and have a wonderful evening.